So the meat of the sandwich today that I want to talk about is the nitrogen management tools that we've developed at UC in partnership with Mark Lundy and a lot of other people putting effort into this, that are basically allowing us to get an idea of what's in the field, what's going on in the field in season, and then applying and then reacting to that. So what's the point of all this? Essentially, we're looking at soil nitrate. We're looking then at canopy reflectance. So we're comparing a reference zone of wheat that has been highly fertilized. So we know that it's not going to be deficient. We've taken a small section of the field and added extra fertilizer to it in the preseason. And then the rest of the field, we're going to compare those two and look at, which canopy are the canopies. Is there a difference in the greenness of the canopy? It's called the reflectance. It's the canopy reflectance is another word for that. But essentially, we're measuring how much green is coming off of that. Putting all this through kind of growth models and patterns that we have already established with the growth of these plants. And that crunches some numbers and punches out an estimate for in-season fertilizer. So how much we would be applying in season. And so before we get started, though, I do want to ask, let's see if I can get this poll to work. I do want to ask, I want to poll the audience here and see, well, we don't have a whole lot of people, but let's go through it anyway. On average, how much of your total fertilizer do you apply pre-plant or at planting? All right. So the reason, so ideally we're putting most of our fertilizer down in season, and there's several reasons for this. Why? One is controlling for risk and externality, weather, drought. This gives us flexibility, accuracy, and reduces our risk exposure, right? So we have an idea of where we are in season. We've eliminated some of the chance and some of the random effects that may have occurred in the season, because ideally we're evaluating this in the season, say at tillering, and by that point we have some information about how the season has gone, and so that reduces our risk and allows us to make adjustments accordingly to what we need to put down. Biological signaling is the other reason. So we want, basically, wheat is and many of the small grains, but wheat in particular is a very plastic plant. It reacts strongly to having an environment that is flush in water and nitrogen and everything signaling it like go for broke. And it will tiller more, it will produce more spikes on its tillers, spiked reproductive tillers, and it will fill up those seed heads more with, with more, there will be more seed on the spikes themselves. And so basically you're setting it up for success. And if the rest of the season, if the season changes later down the line, well, that's something else. But ultimately you don't want to stymie your crop beforehand. So that's what this is doing. Because and there are examples where you'll have a pre-plant application of fertilizer, and the plants at tillering, the crop at tillering will look happy and green. And where you didn't apply that pre-plant fertilizer, you've got these sad looking plants. But if you apply the same amount in season to those sad plants, that sad looking crop, you'll end up getting a bigger yield. So there's examples of that type of pattern. And the point is that these are plastic plants that are able to adjust quite aggressively if given the right conditions. Oh, sorry, there we go. There's my images for that. And what does the Webtool do? It helps us kind of line this all up. So we're going to take the field vitals. We're going to kind of check the vital signs of the field by looking at the canopy and comparing those two canopies. We're going to look at the soil. It is basically our bank account to see how much nitrate is left in there. And then we're going to come up with an estimate of how much we need to put in there or not put down to carry that crop to harvest, the amount of nitrogen that it's going to need to finish it up and go to harvest based on our yield expectations. So next poll then is fertilizer costs. How much does it cost, including diesel, labor, equipment, or amortization, to apply 60 pounds of fertilizer to 100 acres? And I've got a couple choices here. So you can drum roll. The answer is 4,500. Now, this is based, again, this is based on a UC small grains cost study. And so we've got, we're including diesel, labor, equipment, material, all that stuff into that as well. But we're estimating it comes out to about 75 cents a pound per acre. And so over the course of large acreage, that ain't nothing. That adds up. And so that's kind of where we're pulling that number from. So, but then how do we measure these? Once we've got, once we're kind of into the, let's see. Yeah, how do we measure these two things that we were talking about earlier? Our soil nitrate and our relative canopy vigor. First of all, soil nitrate, that's pretty straightforward, right? This is something you can measure pretty much any time, and it's going to be a snapshot in time of how much soil, how much nitrate is available, plant available nitrogen is available to your crop in the soil. What's your bank account look like at that given time? And we do this using the nitrate quick test, which is essentially a 3-to-1 mixture of soil and water. We have a whole tutorial on how to do that. We can't get into that right now, but basically you've got these reactive pads that will change to darker shades of pink, and those are associated then with different values of nitrate in solution. And we've modeled that, and people at UC have modeled that at Plant Sciences to give us a rough estimate, a ballpark estimate of how much we have in the soil. This takes about 10 minutes once you get good at it. Once you've got your soils, your representative sample that you think is going to be a good representation of that field, it takes about 10 minutes. Now for canopy vigor, how do we do that? That's called Ndvi. So this is just basically, again, it's that reflectance measurement. It's how much green is coming back into that lens, into the camera. And we're going to do this by comparing our reference zone, where we put a lot of extra nitrogen down, comparing to the field where it may or may not have sufficient nitrogen, and how different those two numbers are gives us an idea of where we stand. How do we gather that data though? There's a couple ways to do it. One is drone-based imaging, but there are information and material costs associated with that. However, UC A&R does have drone camps and trainings and stuff fairly regularly, well, at least once or twice a year, where you can do some hands-on training with this stuff and get your skills up on that and figure out what you need for all that. In order to do that, there are handheld sensors that unfortunately are no longer really available. There may be more down the road or other ways to do that, but Trimble made the Green Seeker for a while and then they discontinued that. But we have some on hand, so I don't want to offer too much, but in a pinch, I could come out and show you how to use it, or we could talk about that as a farm advisor. That's my job, so I can at least get you an idea of how to set that up. Satellite imagery, the public stuff has pixel limitations. The pixels are too big, oftentimes, or they're not too big, but you have to set up a nitrogen-rich zone in your field that's big enough that you're definitely going to capture at least one pixel in there. But you could use something like Climate Engine. We're going to come up with some materials, hopefully, to guide people through how to use that soon. And then, but there's also private subscription satellite imagery that comes in that is at a higher resolution that you can also get this data out of. Again, so just a few ideas on how that is. But what am I talking about when I talk about this nitrogen-rich zone and then our field rate? So this is kind of what a plot layout might look like. It can be different. It could be in strips. It could be more, bigger or smaller. It just depends on what you're going to use to actually assess the NDVI ratings. And what we're going to do then is compare the canopy of the enriched zone to the field rate. And on top of that, we can also separately check the soil. Again, we can check the soil before the season as well, and that'll give us an idea of how much is in there already, and do we need to apply something, to get going. But the main thing here is we're comparing that canopy. And how do we measure canopy vigor? Here we have our two, different levels of vigor in our canopy. One of them is slightly less green. It's looking perhaps a little deficient. We go out there and scan it. We get our NDVI rating of 0.45. And the place that we've dumped a bunch of extra nitrogen into, say about 60 pounds extra, typically, we get a 0.52. That's called, then we need to get what's called the Sufficiency Index. We're comparing the two of them. And essentially just dividing your field rate by the idealized, high nitrogen zone. And in this case, you'd have a 0.87, say. Another example of that, you might have two that look really similar. And this is just emphasizing the fact that our eyes can't always see this. Ndvi might come at 0.49 and over here is 0.52, right? We can't really see the difference in that green. But that is, 0.94. And that technically on our scale, which we'll see later, is going to be, is maybe there's some deficiency there, something we should look for. Okay, so just to think for yourselves, what do we check? What do we check next? So the next thing you would do in this case would probably look at the soil, right? Like, okay, they're close. It looks like things are pretty sufficient, but maybe not. What else do we need to know? Is it going to make it to the end of the season, given where it is now, with the amount of nitrogen that's in the bank in the soil? So we check that soil nitrate. But let's do this through some case studies. So here's the link below, and hopefully I'll have this presentation up as well as the video, and I'll have all the links and all that. You can refer to all of this separately. But we'll click on this, and here's so I've brought that up on a separate window, and here's our setup. This is in Yolo County. This is dry land. We have a field rate of 24 pounds an acre. So there's basically about 24 pounds have been added in row. And then there's a field rate or plus 60 pounds additional in the enriched zone. So we artificially beefed that up. It's got more nitrogen in it than we probably need up front. The yield expectations are around 4,000 pounds. The protein goal is 10.5%. And this is tillering in late February. So we're going out there in February. It's planted in December, late December. I will say one more thing about this field, just for context. So let's not get too lost in the numbers and all that, but the main takeaway that we got more in the enriched zone, but there was a poultry manure addition to this field earlier in May or April. And so what happened is that the soil nitrate levels were pretty high. And so we looked at that and kind of said, we don't need to add a whole lot extra. And I think the grower wanted to add the inline fertilizer, but it was also a P and K. There was P and K in there. So it's kind of other reasons for that as well, not just the nitrogen, but that's just to set that context. There was prolonged drought early up front. And so the grower had to reduce that the yield estimate from about 4,000 to 2,500. We had these long periods of drought and then these downpours of rain. And so the crops were just getting hammered. So that's an important thing to keep in mind here. The grower intuition is so really important. And here's all the data, but I'm going to punch this into the actual, this is just here for anyone who wants to play with it later. I'm going to punch all this into the tool, and we'll see it there. So, all right. So Mark, you've been helping me here. Are you able to see desktop?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, yeah, cool.
I'm seeing your browser with the field pulled up on it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Great. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. It's good to have some eyes out there. So so we've clicked on the location of the field. I've navigated to the nitrogen management tool, the Webtool. I went and found the field, clicked on that, and this is going to pull data from the UC soil web. So we have some idea of bulk density of these soils and other properties that are important. This happens to be Summit 515, but if you don't have that, you can just put common wheat, and that's probably going to be, it'll get close enough. It's not that important. This field was planted into moisture. This was not irrigated, but if you did irrigate, you can increase your irrigations and you can put in these amounts, which is very important. Now this is for ideally the irrigations that have already occurred. This allows the model to kind of simulate, so if it says, oh, there wasn't any rain, everything's going to be hammered, but you irrigated it, then it's going to be able to adjust and say, okay, so that's what that's for. You'll hit next. And it'll estimate kind of this growth stage. There are a few things that are very useful here to look at. Here's the drought we were talking about. We have this long period. In the dark blue line is our actual rainfall for this year. The dark red line, the solid red line, is the nitrogen uptake curve. So how much over the course of the season that nitrogen is, how far in we are. And you can see here in like February, where we are on February 26th. We're standing out in the field right now in our minds and our imaginations on February 26th. That this is, we haven't actually gone through a lot of the uptake yet. And so there's quite a bit more time left to actually make all those adjustments. But this drought period that we went through as well is reducing that yield. So that's where that adjustment comes in on the grower's side for intuition. The growth stage is automatically calculated, but you can adjust it if need be. If your crops are looking really spindly and small, they might not actually be where the model says, but usually it gets it pretty close based on when your planting dates are and such. All right, and then we talk about what specific measurements, let me check one thing, yeah. Let me talk about what specific measurements we have. Did we take crop reflectance? Yes, we went out there and we got our Ndvi values. We compared those canopies. What types of measurements were taken? Well, we got the reflectance, so we got that Ndvi, and we also did our nitrate from the soil nitrate quick test. And so again, here's our growth stage. Question here is when you want to plant your fertilizer. So you can make those adjustments too if you're not going to do it immediately. If you see a rainstorm coming in a week or two, you can make that estimate. But here's the important part. I haven't written down here. So the sufficiency index we came back was 0.98. And just to reiterate that point, we had our field reflectance value, and then we divided our enriched zone value. We went and zapped it to the Ndvi in the field, got a bunch of numbers, got an average. We went to that enriched zone, did the same thing, put the numbers over the top of each other, field reflectance over enriched zone, and we got ours ended up being 0.98 in that grower's field. Then we looked at our soil nitrate, and there is a link here, right here, that'll take you to the soil nitrate quick test how-to as well. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The servers are down at ANR right now. Part of the reason I couldn't send you guys a reminder, but that'll take you to that site when those servers are back up, or we'll provide an alternative link at some point if those things are broken forever. But anyway, so we get our pad reading and we determine it's a 12. This translates to about 63 pounds per acre, plus or minus 14 total nitrogen, or plant available nitrogen in the ground in the form of nitrate. And we adjusted our yields. Originally, they were supposed to be around 40 sacks, 4,000. But the grower was thinking, because we got hit pretty hard, and it ended up being really close. It was actually really spot on. Even when we over fertilized it, he was spot on in terms of what the yield ended up being. So grower intuition, once again, very important here. Down to 2,500 pounds, and then 10.5 for a protein. So pre-plant fertilizer was 24. We could also count some of that poultry manure, but we don't know how much of that is mineralized. But let's not get into the weeds. This is not that important of a number, but just put down what you put down pre-plant. Just put that number in. It changes the error bars a little bit, but it's not hugely. Again, there's some more information on this if you like. We go through to that, and it comes up with a recommendation of 0, right? This is ultimately the recommendation that the model is telling you, that there's no reason you need to add anything. What does that mean? That means there's enough in the soil, there's enough nitrate in the soil, and based on where we're at now, there's enough. Things will be fine. Just to illustrate this, though, if you added 10 pounds of fertilizer, you've got this green bar as your potential yield increase, but the range of that increase, which is the black line, which is the possible range of that outcome, extends beyond the 0, which means, scientifically speaking, that there's just random, with all the random chances that there's no certainty that you'll actually get that increase. With a protein, it's different. You do see that this black line extends beyond the 0. The protein axis is on the right side here, so the 0 is all the way down here for the protein. 0 is over here for the yield, just the left side and the right side. But the important part here is that this bar does not extend below that. So there is a significant bump. Whether or not that's enough, where we're looking at somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6, is that enough for you to fire up the tractor, take it out there? You know, is the protein, is that going to be enough? And that's a calculation. If you're getting an extra 2% or 1.5%, that might be worth it for you. And again, here we go, 20 pounds, adding 30 pounds, adding 40 pounds. Okay, again, the error bars in our yield are the range in that, the range is greater than the increase. And what that means is you're probably not going to get anything worthwhile adding extra stuff to it at this point. So that's ultimately the take home there. So we'll go back to this. But what does it actually mean, right? So we have all of these recommendations. So what actually happened in the season? And this is, so the field rate where we had no in-season fertilizer, we followed the recommendations, didn't add anything, at 2253 pounds an acre. So pretty close to what the grower was expecting. That's our baseline, right? We went back in March and added an additional 60 pounds. We couldn't get in earlier because there was no rain. And we added an additional 60 pounds just to see what would happen, right? If we went and dumped a bunch of stuff there. We ended up getting, it was a slight yield bump, but it's not actually a yield bump because, again, the range of those error bars is beyond that. So it's not actually, it's not different. We had a slightly different, number, but it's, you can't say that, because we had multiple, sorry, let me just emphasize, we had multiple sites throughout the field, and what's happening is some were lower and some were above, right? So that illustrates the point that we can't say with certainty that like you would have gotten it better. The average is a little higher, but it's not outside. You can't be certain about it. I'm trying to make that clear. Anyway, point being, there's no difference. The model works, and it ends up saving the grower some money. So the planned application was maybe 24 pounds up front and 60 pounds in season. What the grower ended up doing was 24 pounds, just 24 pounds pre-plant. Again, a lot of soil nitrate in the soil from the previous crop and from some compost applications earlier. But essentially, that outcome ends up being that you don't put 60 pounds down, and which may have been the normal habit at that time. It's like what a grower would do. Okay, I'm going to put some before and some after. That's a good practice. But in this case, it doesn't have to do that because things have taken a hit, and he has the ability to move with the drought. And so ends up saving $45 an acre, and that ends up being about $5,000, $5,500 over the course of 121 acres. So no small potatoes. Case study number 2. So that's just something to chew on. Well, the second one, we'll go through this one more time. We'll be a little faster here, sorry. The field rate, again, the soil nitrate was high, so the grower decided not to add anything. If you look at the N-rich zone, we add an additional 60 pounds to that. Slightly higher yield expectations at 6,500 pounds, and the protein goes a little higher. But this is all happening again in late February when we're going out there and checking this, checking the canopy. There were some adjustments that reduced the yield again. This field was actually planted in November, and there was some germination, but that stuff died. And then there was additional germination that came back in December because there was just this, so it was uneven, and there was some weed pressure and obviously the drought. So they reduced the yield estimate a bit. This is an irrigated field though, so they were able to kind of work back a little bit. Here's all the data for that. And let's go back to the model, the web tool. So here we go. I punched in all of this stuff. It happened to be octane. This field was irrigated, but hadn't been irrigated up to that point. All right, similar to what we saw last time, right? Here's our average uptake and our average precipitation, and we're pretty low here. The growth stage, however, and this is again why it matters to be in your field. It's thinking, oh, it's 8.8 because I said it was planted in November, but everything died. Everything came back in December. So I'm actually looking at the field and I'm going, actually, that's not even close. Nothing. We're nowhere near boot, kind of in getting the stem extension and in the boot. We're down actually close to about 4.4. And so the grower makes that adjustment and says, of the crops that have come back with the second flush of rain and survived, the field is at a 4.4. Same thing, we have a reflectance measurement and our soil nitrate quick test. And yes, so we did take these crop canopy and reflectance measurements. And our sufficiency index in this case came up as 0.92. All right, so likely deficient. You can see this here. If I go all the way down here, we're like definitely deficient, right? So 0.92. Again, you can click on this to calculate those values once you have your NDVIs. However you get that, either from drones or a handheld device or whatever. And then our soil nitrate was at 7.5. So you got 46 pounds in the bank with some likely deficiency. So we're probably going to have to add something. The question is how much? And that's going to depend on our yield estimate. Again, we were at 6,500, but now we're down to 5,500. Protein's 11.5, so that's all good. And pre-plant, there was 0. We didn't add anything pre-plant. So the recommendation came back at 60 pounds. The grower ended up putting 50 pounds down, but it's, you know, rough. Let's just call it the same, more or less. And here's why. If we look at this graph this time, that yield increase is actually is at 700, and the range of that error is between 400 and 1,000. So it's above the 0 mark, whereas last time it was below the 0 mark. So it was like, it's not going to make a difference. Here we actually see that, okay, you know, that's going to get you more. And you can play with this, like how much more am I going to get as I go up? But here, you know, you're still getting about the same amount of yield. Your error bars are getting a little bigger, but it's not. So that's why that model punches out that number. 60, you know, 60 is the way to go is what it's saying. And you'll probably get a bit of a protein boost from that between 1.1 and 1.4. Okay, so that's kind of, so that's the end of that was the information the grower had in season. And then, so we were just looking at, and then what's the outcome? I want to look at this first. Let's look at the outcome first. Typically the grower would have actually had 100 pounds ready to go pre-plant and would typically add 50 pounds in season if needed. Not always, kind of just looking at it, seeing how the wheat's doing. The actual application didn't put anything down because there was enough in the soil to use that nitrate quick test up front and decided, okay, we've got some to get going. We've got some at least to get us to tillering. And then they applied 50 pounds in season based on the model recommendation. The outcome is 1,100 pounds increase in yield, and I'll show you that in a minute why we know that. It was because it was an in-season application that made that difference. So that's the extra 1,100 pounds, not just from 50 pounds in the beginning of the season. It's because 50 pounds specifically went down at the tillering phase in season. And then the outcome there, it's a reduction in nitrogen, at least 50 pounds, maybe even more, was reduced in terms of what they would have used this year. And that ends up being $133 an acre, which ends up being about $9,000 net profit through the optimization of these inputs. Just going to go back to this. The grower applied 50 pounds. There's an exclusion zone on the left. That's where we didn't apply anything. Not in the beginning, not in the middle of the season. We just left it all out. That's what we got. That's what we would have had. You just planted into that field, you would have about 4,500 pounds. The field rate is where we went in and did what the model told us to do. Where we just put 50 pounds down, and that's what the grower ended up taking home, right? That's that 5,500 pounds that he took home. It is 1,100 pounds more than the enriched strip. In the enriched strip, if you remember, we added 60 pounds, but we didn't come back and top dress the enriched strip. You don't need to do that. It's just a reference for that time in the season. And so that ended up getting 1,100 pounds less. And so this is a good illustration of where that in-season fertilizer becomes really important and can be very valuable, both in reducing your waste, but also maximizing whatever you're putting down by stimulating that plant response, that biologic plant response. Okay, so the in-season, so the take homes for all of this before we go any further, the in-season applications give you higher yields per pound of N. The Webtool works by leveraging the canopy reflectance and the soil nitrate that we get in season. We get that information in season, and your profit increases can be substantial and are probably worth the effort. Special thanks to all of these folks and our collaborators and just so many people that went into putting this model together. I played a minor role in it. Now I get to talk about it like I'm an expert in all of it. But with that, I'm going to open up the poll, but you guys don't need to take that. We can just chat in the meantime. And so I can get my mouse back over on this side. And I'm just going to, if you guys want to take, if you guys have a minute to take that poll, I'd appreciate it. It helps me get some feedback. Regarding cures credits, because our site is down at ANR, if you can all email me, that would be, if you just email me and let me know. Should have my, here, I'll put my email address here. If you need the cures credits, just email me and let me know, and we'll sort that out. I apologize. That was supposed to be nice and automated and just have it all right. But I can see who else here, and so if anyone needs that credit, let me know. And I will send out. So here's I'm going to launch this poll for you to take. But I'm just going to let that run for a while, so we don't need to touch that yet. I'll just keep that up, and that's anonymized and all that as well. That's just for our demographics and also for the efficacy of the presentation. And then we've got 7 minutes for questions, way less than I wanted to, but we can. I'm happy to stick around, and you can always email me and we can talk about this more. But if anyone's got questions, I'll open it up. Go ahead and unmute yourselves. I think you should be able to unmute yourselves, and or you can put it in the chat.
There's a couple of chat questions already.
Oh, there are? I didn't, oh, it didn't say it, notify. Oh, that's because it was, the window was open. Okay. Does the protein estimate take into account the variety? Okay, so first question, does the protein estimate take into account the variety? Mark, you might actually be able to answer that better than I will. I'm assuming it might. Because we do, yeah, I'm assuming it does, because we gather that data from all the varieties. I
can answer that if you want me to.
Yeah,
but it only indirectly,
okay.
Because the way that the variety enters into the model is that different varieties have different phases of growth or grow at different rates, and so it will change the remaining nitrogen budget. But in terms of the division of how much is going to yield versus how much is going to protein, it doesn't take it into account directly.
So based on the crop days to maturity, right?
Yeah, so the remaining budget does affect the protein yield division. So if you're later in the season, more of the nitrogen is going to go to protein, less of it's going to go to yield. And the variety effect does say where you are in your nitrogen budget. So if you have an earlier maturing variety, you're going to be higher chance of being farther along, and you're going to have a higher chance of more of your nitrogen going to protein than yield. But it's not really, the variety name is not really taking that into account directly. It's indirect through where you are in your nitrogen budget. But so yeah, it would, but it'd be indirect. And just to say, out of all the sources of variance in that model, it's a pretty small, that would be pretty small. That effect would be pretty small.
Yeah. And just to illustrate that, what Mark was talking about here is that this is your nitrogen uptake curve. And I think ostensibly then for some varieties, that curve would be a little steeper, because ultimately the length of its season would be a little longer or shorter in that case. And if it had a longer season variety, longer days to maturity variety, then that curve might be a little slower. But ultimately, we're seeing an average, based on climate modeling and whatnot. And so that's, yeah. But again, emphasizing the fact that we're fairly low on the uptake. We're in the middle, we're in the end of February, and we actually haven't taken up a whole lot of that nitrogen yet. It's all coming in at, between March and April, at least in that year, or on average, that's when most of that kind of occurs. And so if you just dose it with nitrogen at that time, you're not going to get as much leaching, and it's just a little more effective in stimulating that biological response. So anyway, David, does field size affect estimates? I mean, it might, depending on how you're sampling. But if you've got wildly different soil types across your fields, but ultimately, No, because ultimately the recommendation should be just pounds per acre. So if it says, if it's just going to go on a per acre basis. Yeah, and then you'd have, then you scale up whatever you need for your hopper and stuff, and that's pounds of N, right? That's not pounds of fertilizer, pounds of N. So if it's urea, you've got to divide it by 0.46 and get you how much urea you're actually going to put down for that, for example. Yeah, but yeah.
You times it by 0.46.
Well, if you have your total N, the amount that if you want to put 60 pounds down of N, then you would divide it by 0.46, and that would give you a bigger number, which would be that would be your fertilizer, right? If you're going the other way around,
that's your pounds of urea that you apply then. Correct.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what exactly. Thanks. So if we had 60 pounds, I'm going to apply 60 pounds of urea, it'd be 130. 60 pounds of N is 130 pounds of urea. So yeah, it's almost double. It's there's only half of that mass is actually nitrogen. Okay. Are there? Yeah, urea is that's true organic. I don't know if there are other forms. David says it's helpful to know. I wish I could apply urea instead of poultry manure. David's an organic farmer, so yeah, organic farming has some limitations in that regard, in how nimble it is. But there may be some products that are pelletized that you might be able to put out there that might not be as quick as urea to get out there, but would, I don't know. Or you could, you might be able to do some injection of some sort if you're irrigated. Okay, any other questions? Okay, Chris has a question. Are there plans to expand the tool in the future? What might future functionality include? I'm not sure. I think the big hurdle, Mark can comment on that, but I think the big hurdle right now is getting people to use this at all, because there's a bit of an information step up and kind of cost up front. But we're showing that it can be helpful, so maybe we get some pickup that way. So baby steps is what I'm saying. Mark, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I could comment. I mean, we are trying to extend the base models so that they can take other measurements that aren't based on sufficiency index that Conrad has been demonstrating. Historically, tissue testing of plants has been a way to determine deficiency. Given the nature of our cropping system in the state of California, that's not very widely used because the costs don't generally justify it. But we have had some people mention that it would be nice to be able to apply the same kind of framework to tissue testing. So we're trying to kind of backfill the relationship between tissue testing and reflectance. And I think that would be a reasonable next step for extending this. And then the other part that would be more of a longer term thing would be we're directly accounting for water. Conrad didn't talk about it a ton here, but one of the assumptions of the model is that all those recommendations assume that you have water available. And so if you don't have water available, then the recommendations would be not really as applicable.
Well, and just to clarify, water, I mean, we're assuming that water available either in the form of rain, rain is going to occur as normal.
Yeah, but irrigation. It's the assumption is that the crop is not going to be limited by water after the irrigation. And there's ways for us to account for water stress and reduce the estimate accordingly in a more direct way. But right now we're not directly doing that because we don't have quite enough data to do that.
And let me just comment too, is that just to clarify, Mark discussed this with me this morning and I still forgot to mention it. had water available, had irrigation, and that was that. So they were able to put some water down, and that's part of the reason that their yields kind of were able to bounce back, and the model was more accurate. It was pretty accurate in that regard because they did have some water there. The first grower didn't have water, but their intuition reduced that yield estimate, kind of knowing what their field was capable of, and actually was pretty close. So it ended up being a good estimate of how much nitrogen was required to get that crop, to maximize what you could do with it based on what they were seeing, the data that we had. We've got a comment here from Fritz. This tool will be very useful to help reduce nitrate leaching by making it easier for us to make in-season application decisions. And so, yeah, I agree with that. I think that's one of the goals, obviously, is to reduce leaching and stuff. But I think one of my primary motivators is that this is money in the pockets of growers, whether that's doing a better yield or kind of optimizing their fertilizer use and getting it, using the right amount when they need it. So yeah, so all of those things, all of the above. I think it's really exciting to see the amount of money that people were able to kind of net with this. And obviously, I can't guarantee anything, but I think it speaks to the power of using this data and where it actually can kind of bring stuff home. So, does anyone else have any further questions? I don't want to. Okay, good. Getting kudos from people. Anyway, so I will post this either to the blog, or we'll find a place on Plant Sciences to put it. Ideally, though, just if you're not subscribed already, let me know and I can put you in to the Sacramento Field Crops blog. Send me an email, or you can just go to the site, Sacramento Field Crops, Sac Valley Field Crops. It's a UCANR site. It's a blog. You can subscribe to that. That's how I'm doing most of my communication. Also, the Small Grains blog, the UCANR Small Grains blog. Again, they're down right now, but if you navigate to those, once the site is back up, you can subscribe to that. And that's a really good way to stay in touch with some of these updates, and then again, we'll post that video or a link to this video there as well. Any of that information like that in the future. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the insightful questions. And if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me or other colleagues of mine. So thank you very much and have a good one.